Today on Brief History, we take a brief dive into the life and legacy of one of the most famous kings of Britain. During his life, some of the most memorable world events would take place, as Britain and the world at large engaged in struggle after struggle. His time as king would see an empire split, bloody revolution, factional politics, and the unfortunate madness of a reigning monarch. Join me as I take a brief look at the last king of America, remembered today as King George III. George was born at Norfolk House in London, England, on June 4th, 1738. He was the son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, the at the time heir apparent to the British crown, and his mother was Augusta of Saxe-Gotha. He was named after his great-grandfather, King George I of Great Britain, and was said to have been born 2 months early, forcing him to be baptized soon after his birth for fear that he would die. George was born during the reign of his grandfather, King George II of Great Britain, who was the second in the line of the so-called Hanoverian kings, who were referred to as such due to the fact that George's family house hailed from Germany, and specifically an area referred to as Hanover, which was part of the then Holy Roman Empire, but exists today in modern-day Germany. The House of Hanover was settled on as the heirs to the British crown after the Stuart dynasty that had ruled for a century before them had either been deposed or had died without legitimate issue, and the Hanoverians were specifically chosen from the long line of potential heirs specifically due to their Protestantism. Although the Stuarts still had legitimate claims to the British crown, the last serious push to see them reinstated as monarchs would take place during George's grandfather's time as king via the so-called Jacobite Rising of 1745. This would ultimately be defeated, and although there would still be some Stuarts with legitimate claims all the way through much of George's life, the 45 Jacobite Rising was the last true Stuart threat to Hanoverian sovereignty in Britain. George was to be the first Hanoverian king born in Britain, as his great-grandfather George I, his grandfather George II, and his father Prince Frederick had all been born in Hanover and traveled to Britain as adults. Despite George's premature birth, he eventually grew into a healthy and plump child, and was initially instructed by a man named Francis Ascough, mainly in religious affairs. Lord Guildford was appointed as his governor, and he was tutored by the mathematician George Lewis Scott initially. George began his learning on a wide range of topics, including languages, which included Latin, French, and German, math, history, dancing, fencing, etc., etc. He was also instructed in the way of the Anglican faith, which was the national church of England. The Anglican faith would become important throughout George's life, as he would be the first Hanoverian king to truly take his Anglican faith seriously. George's early life was influenced by the relationship that he had had with his father, Prince Frederick, and the relationship that his father had had with George's grandfather, the king, George II. The Hanoverian kings had had a history of hatred with their heirs apparent, and George's grandfather and his father would be no different in this regard. George I had disliked George II, and George II disliked George's father, and George himself, as we will see, would find his eldest son and heir difficult as well. Despite this, George and his own father, the Prince of Wales, Frederick, were said to have had a good relationship, and Frederick worked hard to instill in George the ideas of a so-called patriot king, which would, in essence, curb national spending and throw off the oligarchic stranglehold that the Whig political party had on politics in Britain at the time. The Whig Party had grown into a political giant in British politics and culture, and had developed incredible influence during the reigns of George I and George II. This, in part, was why George II hated George's father so much, as Prince Frederick was keen on opposing the king publicly, and was the champion of the Tory political party and the so-called opposition Whigs, although the parties themselves were not political parties in the way we think of them today. George soaked up his father's message, that of a patriot king that should lead a nation free from political faction or oligarchic influence, and live and govern conservatively and constitutionally. Unfortunately for George, his father, Prince Frederick, died in 1751 when George was around 13 years old. This was a difficult blow for George to have been dealt, and he did not take it well. Not only had he lost his father figure, but he now, at the young age of 13, became the Prince of Wales himself and the heir apparent to the British crown. Luckily, he still had his mother, Augusta, who was very protective of her eldest son, to take steps to protect him in the larger picture. A regency plan was made, where if George's grandfather, the king, died while George was still in his minority, his mother would become acting regent, although George's uncle, the Duke of Cumberland, would ultimately have control of affairs. This was somewhat concerning at the time, as the Duke of Cumberland, known today for his brutal treatment of the Jacobites after the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, had not got on well with George's father, and there was concern that George's powerful uncle and duke would attempt to seize the throne for himself once the king died. Although this would ultimately not be the case, George retained a degree of suspicion of his uncle for some time, although not forever. When George was around 17 years old, a man was made his governor who would have a large impact on him in the coming years. This man had been a friend of George's father, and after George's father's death, had befriended George's mother to the point that his mother decided it prudent to make him George's tutor. His name was John Stuart, Earl of Bute, and he overhauled George's education and learning into something that the young prince delighted in. Bute, in essence, became the father figure that George had taken from him when his father died, and influenced George on a wide range of topics, including morality and virtue. Although George loved his new tutor, and the pair would remain friends and allies for some time, as we will shortly see, Bute's influence on George would, in time, not be accepted by many within the British power sphere, and would cause serious trouble for George in his future. George's great-grandfather George I and his grandfather George II's reigns were remembered for being plagued by international struggles between many of the world's greatest powers. Unfortunately, George's life and time as king would be no different, as the 18th century would be filled with many incredible and compelling international conflicts. In May 1756, the 7 Years' War broke out on the continent, which ran parallel to the French and Indian War, which was taking place on the North American continent. Although there were many players in these conflicts, for the purpose of George's story, it is important to note that Britain was almost always opposed to France in all theaters of war, despite the shifting alliance structure that began to come about around this time in order to limit the influence of any one great power. France was allied with Austria and Russia in the 7 Years' War on the continent against Britain, Prussia, and Hanover, Hanover being ruled in a personal union by the Hanoverian monarchs of Britain. The French-Indian War saw the French, who had control of then French Canada, pitted mainly against the British and their 13 American colonies, with the assistance on both sides of Native American tribes. The conflicts initially went poorly for Britain in all theaters, but when a man named William Pitt the Elder came to power in British politics, he assisted in turning things around in a dramatic way. Victories began to be won by the Brits in all theaters of war, including in America, which made Pitt extremely popular with the British populace. Pitt took an imperial approach to defeating France and sent men and supplies to America at a time when France was reluctant to do so. Pitt had decided to take on the war full force, and it worked. Interestingly, this was counter to what Pitt had advocated previously, as he had, prior to becoming the leading figure in the war effort, been opposed to such moves. George and Bute actually had sided with Pitt when he was opposed to vigorously fighting the war, and were disappointed when this changed, as they and their faction, which was basically the remnants of George's father's faction when he lived, were concerned about national spending. Nevertheless, the war was prosecuted with success, as victories on the continent and in America led to the so-called Annus Mirabilis of 1759, a year of great gains for Britain in the 7 Years' War and the French and Indian War. Hanover was defended at the Battle of Minden on the continent, and French Canada was eventually secured by the British after the Battle of Quebec saw the British victorious. Pitt was seen as a national hero, to the chagrin of George's aging grandfather George II. But George's grandfather was on the last leg of his long life and reign. In late October 1760, with international war still raging, George's grandfather the king died. George was out riding when he was told the news that he would now be the new king of Britain. A new, incredibly long and drama-filled chapter of George's life had just begun. George's accession marked the beginning of one of the longest reigns in British history, although no one knew that would be the case at the time. Over the course of the discussions we are about to get into, there is an enormous amount of information and events that took place during George's time as king, and due to the fact that it would be difficult to fit all that into one discussion, it is prudent to discuss a few things before getting into a chronological discussion of events. Therefore, at this point, we will discuss first and foremost George's personality so that one can keep this information in the back of one's mind as we walk through the major events of his reign. Secondly, we will briefly list off some things that will not come up during his story, but are nevertheless interesting facts to know and understand, as they too can give some context to his reign, although not all these things will necessarily be important pieces of information as it relates to George's story at large. So, as far as George's personality goes, it is important to note that he had been raised in a cultured household, as his father, Prince Frederick, was said to have been a much more cultured individual when compared to George II or George I. This cultured upbringing was furthered by George's mother and his mentor, Bute, who exposed George to a wide range of potential interests. George ultimately took interest in many things, which included the natural sciences, music, architecture, art, scholarship, astronomy, and collecting. When it came to collecting, he especially loved collecting books, and over his lifetime stockpiled an incredible collection of books and literary works, which now make up a chunk of the British Museum's collection in modern-day Britain. When it came to architecture, he of course was a fan of and promoted the neoclassical style that had begun to be revived during the reign of his grandfather and great-grandfather, known today as Georgian, which among many other aspects tend to reflect grand symmetrical architectural works. When it came to music, he learned to play the piano, flute, organ, and the harpsichord, with the harpsichord being an instrument that will come up at the end of his story. He was also very approachable and an avid hunter, enjoying stag and hare hunting well into his 60s. George was anti-slavery and never owned a slave in his life, which is in stark contrast to many of the founding fathers of America, some of whom we will discuss in time. George believed that slavery was morally wrong, and in fact, the Foreign Slave Trade Act, which banned the foreign trade of slaves in Britain, was passed during George's time as king, although slavery was not abolished throughout the British Empire until after his death. His mother and Bute were incredibly influential in teaching George that it was important to be a morally upstanding individual, and they were the ones who instilled in George this strong sense of morality and duty that he would develop over his life. He, in contrast to many kings and aristocrats at the time, steered clear of gambling, brothels, drinking, and other vices that were common in British culture. He would be faithful to his wife, as we will see, and took no mistresses as many of the previous kings of Britain had done for decades. He took his religion and coronation oath to defend the Protestant religion very seriously, which we will also see become important towards the end of his story. These virtues did not mean that George was perfect. He certainly wasn't. He may have thought slavery was a despicable institution and morally wrong, but it should be noted that he did not actively campaign to abolish it, and in being the leader of a major nation, it is of course not surprising that George sometimes had to sacrifice his moral principles for what he perceived to be in the best interest of himself or the nation politically or economically, especially when dealing with faction within his government. Nevertheless, it is important to note George's moral stance on certain topics, as it obviously influenced him throughout his reign. So with that being said, let's discuss a list of topics that are interesting to note and certainly related to George's time as king, but that won't necessarily come up during the discussions we are about to get into. First off, George had a large family when it came to siblings. He was one of 9 siblings himself, and this, mixed with the large family he would produce with his wife, something that we will get into later, meant that he had many family members that, even at his accession, would need supporting. Second, George in 1762 purchased Buckingham House as a present for his wife, which would throughout time be upgraded and updated into the magnificent Buckingham Palace, perhaps the most famous residence of the British monarchs in modern day. Third, George was not a traveler. He never visited many of his dominions, including America, Hanover, Scotland, or Ireland, nor did he travel to the continent. Fourth, over George's many years as king, there were multiple assassination attempts on his life, none of which were successful. Various ways of assassination were attempted, including stabbing, shooting, etc., but all were ultimately thwarted. Although some of these perpetrators were executed, George often sympathized with some of them and spared some due to what he perceived to be as their insanity. Fifth, George was incredibly interested in naval and agricultural affairs and would over his life stay very well informed on such matters. In fact, he would develop the nickname Farmer George, although this was used as a negative slight towards him in his time. He, over his life, paid close attention to new techniques being formed in the agricultural sector, including things like crop rotation and other farming techniques, and he often spent time, when away from London, discussing livestock and crops with local farmers who oftentimes did not know who he was. Lastly, the massive island of Australia began to be colonized during the reign of George III, which, as many know today, was used as a penal colony for convicts who were able to escape execution by agreeing to go to the colony. So with that out of the way, let us continue on with George's story chronologically. Once George came to the realization that he was now the King of Great Britain and Ireland, as well as Elector of Hanover, he immediately wrote to his mentor Bute. Bute was now to come to the forefront of politics, and George fully intended on bringing him into the new government that he was to form. It came as a shock to the oligarchic old Whigs, who had been in power for so long, that George was looking at possibly bringing in fresh blood to his government and did not want to continue with the political status quo, that being the old Whigs in power at the head of a Hanoverian king-led government. In fact, George was committed to having a balanced government if he could, and 5 of the Whigs' political opponents, the Tories, were appointed to court positions in 1760. Bute was made George's Groom of the Stole and elected to the House of Lords, and would ultimately become George's first Prime Minister, which is important to note due to the fact that George would have no less than 12 Prime Ministers during his reign, all of which we will touch on. The only problem with Bute being Prime Minister was that he was hated, or would become hated, by almost everyone in London, especially in the powerful factions within the government. Bute was hated first and foremost because he was a Scot, but he was also despised due to the fact that many believed that he had carried on an affair with George's mother, Augusta, after George's father had died, although this was certainly not true. Furthermore, Bute was woefully inexperienced to be George's prime minister and was not prepared for the cutthroat and brutal, factionally influenced battleground that was British politics in the 18th century. As we will see shortly, Bute would come to regret taking on the premiership under his young former steward. Nevertheless, by the time that George became king, he was ready to find a wife, as he had been struggling with his desire for women for some time, being 22 when he ascended to the throne. George had actually been smitten with a woman named Sarah Lennox in 1759 and desperately wanted to marry her at the time, but given her social status, he was advised against it and ultimately decided against marrying her despite feeling sexually suppressed and longing for a wife at the time. His grandfather had also tried to set him up with a German princess in order to strengthen the German bonds on the continent around Hanover, but this had been opposed by both George and his mother and never came to fruition. George had been the first unmarried British monarch in over a century and was the youngest king to come to the throne since Edward VI, the Tudor boy king, son of Henry VIII. Thus, it was time for him to find a wife, and he set out to do so by having his advisors compile a list of potential brides. That list was quickly dwindled down to one person, a young woman from the small German Grand Duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz named Charlotte. George and Charlotte were married in September 1761, and this marriage would prove to be a happy one, as the two quickly found common ground and shared many of the same interests. As we have already touched on, George would remain faithful to his wife for the entirety of his life and never took any mistresses. Over the time, the two often found it difficult to be apart, and went as far as sleeping in the same bed, something that was not common for royal couples at the time. The couple would have an incredibly large family, having 15 children, which would include 2 future kings of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. George's children included his eldest son and heir apparent, George, who will come up throughout the rest of George's story, and not necessarily in a good way, Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, George's favorite son, who would go on to have a successful military career, Prince William, Duke of Clarence, one of the future kings we just touched on, Princess Charlotte, who would become Queen of Württemberg after marrying Frederick I, Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, who would be the father of a future British monarch, Princess Augusta Sophia, who would not marry but would live to be 71 years old, Princess Elizabeth, who would be married to Frederick VI, Landgrave of Hesse-Homburg, Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, who would later become the King of Hanover. Of course, this was after his father had become King of Hanover, something we'll touch on later in George's story. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, the only of George's adult sons not to pursue a military career. Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge, George's last son to survive to adulthood. Princess Mary, who would be married to Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. Princess Sophia, who would never marry, but would have a scandalous rumor surround her during her life. Prince Octavius, who would die young after being inoculated from the smallpox virus. Prince Alfred, who would also die shortly after being inoculated by the smallpox virus. And lastly, Princess Amelia, who never married officially, but will come up again at the end of George's story. Although George preferred his daughters to his sons, he was considered a very loving father and did his best to interact with and love his children, despite the trouble some of them would cause him throughout his life. Queen Charlotte and George's children will come up here and there throughout the rest of George's story. As a side note that has nothing to do with George's story, it is interesting to note that modern historical revisionists have, for whatever reason, pushed the idea that Queen Charlotte was of African descent, and this has been widely circulated in recent years. This is almost certainly false, and most scholars denounce or reject these claims. The claims seem to have first emerged in 1929 and were furthered in the 1940s and 90s and rely on minimal to no historical evidence other than a few offhanded contemporary comments about the Queen's appearance late in life and a portrait in which some have interpreted her as having African features. Some have also claimed that Charlotte had a 13th century ancestor that apparently gave her her African appearance, but even if Charlotte did have an African ancestor, being 10 to 15 generations removed from this ancestor would have diluted her genetics to the point that it would most likely not have affected her appearance. Nevertheless, despite the evidence to the contrary, many in the modern day have chosen to believe that Charlotte was indeed of African descent and have begun to reflect her as such in modern media. After George and Charlotte were crowned in September 1761, attention turned to the 7 Years' War that was still raging throughout North America and the continent. George and Bute were keen on seeking peace, but William Pitt, who had been the national hero that had turned the tide of the war through his successful prosecution of it, wanted to declare war on Spain. Pitt, upset that his advice was not being followed, resigned and was replaced by one of Lord Bute's friends. By this time, Bute's unpopularity was growing, as many began to see him for what he was, an inexperienced individual who was only in the position that he was in due to his connection and friendship with the new young king, a royal favorite, if you will. The London mobs began to harass Bute and the king, as the mob still held affection for William Pitt due to his successes in turning the war around. William Pitt had resigned from office also in objection to making peace with France separately from Prussia, who was a British ally after the so-called diplomatic revolution had taken place, which saw the international alliance picture change dramatically. This resignation, along with other important governmental resignations, was what led to Bute officially taking on the prime minister role. Ironically, Britain did end up declaring war on Spain, despite George's continuing desire to want peace, which was troubling to some in that the one man that was seen as the only person that could wage the war effectively, Pitt, was now out of the picture, and the man at the political helm was the detested Bute. Nevertheless, Britain and her allies continued to win victories over the French and Spanish, both on the continent and in America. In the end, peace would indeed be reached via the Treaty of Paris in 1763, along with other adjacent treaties between other foreign powers. The end of the 7 Years' War and the French-Indian War in America for Britain was important because the Peace of Paris essentially set the stage for the next unfortunate and incredible chapter in George's reign. The treaty secured for Britain Canada from the French, Florida from Spain, and all of so-called Louisiana east of the Mississippi River. The 13 American colonies were obviously also to remain under British control, along with other Caribbean and continental gains. Unfortunately, George and Britain had battled against or offended many of the major European powers, and was isolated politically after the wars, which will become important, as we will see shortly. Despite the victories won and territories gained, some in Britain were still not happy with the peace, which unsurprisingly included William Pitt and some of the general populace in London who attempted to take their anger out on the detested favorite, the Earl of Bute. George was not treated well by many in London either, as many times he and Bute were booed or had rocks thrown at their carriages, but this reflected only a small minority in London, as the rest of the country was, for the most part, happy that the war was over. Bute was understandably anxious about being so hated by some within the kingdom, however, and feared for his life to the point that he began to start requesting to resign his role as Prime Minister, which was declined by George. As would be expected, after a war, the national debt was high, and the British government hoped that it could stabilize its newly acquired overseas possessions on the North American continent as soon as possible. Historically, the British government had had the right to tax America, but had allowed a degree of autonomy there, which had led to a quasi-independent state there both in practice and in the minds of the people. However, after Britain had risked life and limb and spent a good amount of money in order to protect the American colonies from the French and certain Native American tribes, the government believed that, at a bare minimum, the American colonies should be taxed in order to cover the costs of their own protection. There were also now tens of thousands of people in French Canada, Spanish Florida, and Native American populations who would have to be policed as they transitioned into the British Empire. Thus, a British military force was deemed necessary for America to keep the peace. Although in George's mind, as well as in the mind of many of his ministers, there should have been no issue with the American colonists paying for their own protection and policing, the colonists had other ideas and would vigorously oppose any attempt by Britain to impose taxes, despite the sacrifice that many British soldiers had made in protecting the colonies and the sums of money spent to win the French and Indian War. By the mid-1760s, the autonomy that had been extended to the colonists in America gave them a sense of independence that many wished to push further into America being its own full-blown separate country. Nevertheless, George believed that he had the legal right to tax his realms across the Atlantic and was keen to do so, again, in order to pay for America's own upkeep. Furthermore, the British government had been aided by certain Native American tribes during the French and Indian War in America, and had made agreements with them to limit westward expansion of the American colonies. As one would expect, this was very unpopular with the colonists. By April 1763, George's companion and Prime Minister, Lord Bute, was finally allowed to resign his premiership, which was then taken up by a man named George Grenville, someone who George greatly disliked. Bute remained in favor and in close contact with George for the time being, but was eventually discarded by George completely as time went on. Grenville was a proponent of taxing the American colonies, as was George, but they were opposed by the old Whig faction that had lost power during the 7 Years' War, which included William Pitt. Pitt and his allies were opposed to taxing the American colonies, but were not able to prevent George and his government from attempting to do so. In April 1764, the Sugar Act was passed in the British Parliament in one of the first steps towards attempting to tax the American colonies to pay for its own defense and upkeep. By the end of the year, the act was being protested by the assemblies in many of the colonies, including Massachusetts. The well-known phrase that many Americans today learn in their youth, as one of the first rebellious cries of a nation under oppression, began to be uttered: "No taxation without representation," although in time, it would be demonstrated that the leaders in America were more geared towards independence than representation. The motto, although good for propaganda purposes, was insincere, as Britain would eventually offer representation at a later date, which would be turned down. Interestingly, in early 1765, George came down with an illness that was hidden or suppressed from the public by the Queen and his advisors. Although he eventually recovered, he had begun to act erratically while ill, and it is believed by some that this was most likely an early bout of a serious mental illness that George had, which will come up again throughout the rest of his story. Many have claimed over the decades that George suffered from a disease known as porphyria, but some in modern times have concluded that this diagnosis is incorrect and that, in fact, George suffered from manic depression, aka bipolar disorder. Whatever the case, this mental illness most likely showed itself for a short time in 1765. Nevertheless, George was in a decent enough state of mind to assent to the Stamp Act in March 1765, which was a tax on the certification of documents, including all printed paper, and had nothing to do with postage as we think of the word stamp in the modern day. This tax was vehemently opposed by the American colonists, whose assemblies sent in their petitions of protest on the matter. As British troops were now seen as a group that could possibly enforce these new regulations, both in taxes and westward expansion limitation, the colonists only saw further reason to oppose what was being decided in Britain as it pertained to North America. It was not long before the officers in charge of enforcing the taxes were being threatened and attacked. For the first time, the colonies called on one another to meet at a Continental Congress to devise a unified protest to what they perceived to be as the injustices coming out of Britain. In October 1765, the Stamp Act Congress met in New York to protest the Stamp Act, although it included only 9 of the 13 colonies at the time. George, continuing to despise his Prime Minister Grenville, eventually sacked him and replaced him with a man named Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquis of Rockingham, George's third Prime Minister. Rockingham wanted to repeal the Stamp Act, in part to try and get William Pitt to join his ministry, which George was not keen on, as it certainly could be seen as the crown bowing to American threats, which he considered, not unreasonably, to be illogical and unreasonable themselves. Nevertheless, Rockingham's governmental attempts to repeal the Stamp Act passed in the Commons and in the Lords, and was assented to begrudgingly by George in March 1766, which caused widespread celebration, especially in America. Rockingham, sensing that George wanted Pitt as Prime Minister, resigned his post and went into opposition. William Pitt then became George's fourth Prime Minister, but his time in this role would be in stark contrast to his time as a leading figure in the 7 Years' War. Pitt was raised to the peerage as the Earl of Chatham, and it was hoped that he could finally be a stable figure in the premiership for George. This was not to be. Pitt went through serious psychological changes and experienced severe physical and mental afflictions, including depression, to the point that he left London and would see no one, not even George. Pitt's lack of direction in his leadership role allowed further internal duties, known as the Thompson Acts, to be passed, which imposed taxes and/or regulations on an array of things, including tea. Some of the colonists responded by boycotting British exports, which caused them to fall by half. Tensions were rising between Britain and America, but this was unfortunately just the beginning of the troubles for George. In October 1768, Pitt requested to resign his premiership, which was granted, and he was replaced by a man named Augustus Fitzroy, Duke of Grafton, George's fifth Prime Minister. Pitt would return to the House of Lords and would eventually die in 1778 in a dramatic way while giving a speech in Parliament. However, his legacy would not end with his death, as his son and namesake would become an important figure in George's life and will be discussed in time. The new Prime Minister, the Duke of Grafton, had been the de facto Prime Minister in essence while Pitt was away battling his mental illness, but would be largely ineffective in this role and resigned in 1770. The Duke of Grafton was replaced as Prime Minister by one of George's friends in childhood, a man named Frederick North, Lord North, who would hold the position for 12 years, much longer than any of his predecessors. In May 1770, the Townshend duties were repealed with the exception of one item, tea, which remained in place due to it representing Britain's right to tax and due to the fact that it was 100% re-exported from Asia. Unfortunately for Lord North and George, this repeal was to do little, as on the same day, the so-called Boston Massacre took place, where a Boston crowd was fired upon by British troops after they had been harassing and throwing stones at the soldiers. Although only 5 people were killed, this too was seized upon by the propagandists of the day to reflect Britain as a bloodthirsty, tyrant-led nation bent on keeping the American colonists under their far-reaching absolutist thumb. In 1773, the Tea Act was implemented by the British Parliament. It was hoped that in addition to bailing out the British East India Company, which was having troubles at the time, this act would undercut the prices of illegal tea that the colonists were bringing in, and thus eliminate the demand for it. This would also, in theory, have actually lowered the price of tea for the colonists as well, but this, of course, did not matter. By that time, the damage had been done, and the American patriots did not want to fund the British government in any way or give any type of legitimization to the British tax system. Therefore, it was deemed necessary to prevent colonists from purchasing this tea. On the evening of December 16, 1773, the so-called Sons of Liberty, perhaps in collusion with Boston merchant smugglers, executed an attack on the British ships carrying the tea into the Boston harbor, while dressed as Native Americans in order to not be identified. This event would eventually famously become known as the Boston Tea Party. Tarring and feathering began to be used as a way to target British officials, which was a particularly painful punishment for the unfortunate experiencer. When George was informed of the Boston Tea Party, he decided to move towards a much more hardline stance than he had had previously, and wanted the perpetrators caught and punished. Thus, it was not long before the so-called coercive acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, were passed in the British Parliament in 1774, which in part closed the Boston harbor and punished the Massachusetts colonists. Furthermore, the Quebec Act was passed, which in part granted religious toleration to the French-speaking Canadians in the North, which brought the ever-contentious issue of religion into the picture. George, of course, was a committed Anglican Protestant, but this act was meant as more of an appeasement to the Roman Catholic French in that territory, and it worked well, with the exception that the American propagandists in the South could now claim that Britain was going to push some form of revived popery on them. Again, the propaganda floodgates were opened and directed towards Britain, although there was no truth to the claims. For some time, the colonists had focused their energy on denouncing Westminster and the British Parliament's rights to tax them, while maintaining a feigned, or rather forced, submission to George publicly. But after the coercive acts came into play, the tides turned and the propaganda machine was now turned directly against George himself. One of the men who was extremely critical of George during this time was a 31-year-old man named Thomas Jefferson, who would become one of the most famous critics of George. Again, the colonies looked to call yet another Congress, but this time of all the 13 colonies, in which they would decide the next steps to take against George and his government. In September 1774, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where they again drew up a petition in order to list out their grievances via the so-called Declaration of Rights and Resolves. A Second Continental Congress was announced for the following year, but major events would take place before this Congress would ever get the chance to meet. The Americans were already purchasing gunpowder from foreign powers and preparing for war. Despite this, George and the British government still believed that war could be averted and continued to seek diplomatic solutions to stymie the progress of hostilities. It was not until February 1775 that the British Parliament declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. Nevertheless, on April 19, 1775, after a British Redcoat regiment on its way to capture an ammunition depot near Concord was engaged by an American Patriot Militia Minutemen force near Lexington, the anonymous shot heard round the world was fired, igniting one of the most influential wars in world history, the American Revolutionary War. With war at hand and conflict on the horizon, the American patriots claimed that they were now standing up to the tyranny of George III, who would enslave the American masses if he was successful in the war against them. The irony in all this was that the colonists in America were already some of the freest individuals in the world, barring the hundreds of thousands of slaves in the country at the time. As we have already discussed, there was a large degree of autonomy in the American colonies, and the taxes that were extracted from the colonists never left America and were intended essentially to break even in the cost of protecting what Britain saw as their brethren across the sea. The American colonists were not oppressed by the British government. In fact, they had been quite lenient with them for some time, and George was certainly not acting as a tyrant. But propaganda was, and still is, a powerful political tool, and once independence was determined to be the course of action for those in power in the colonies, there was little chance of evading conflict. The question now was how to win the war against the colonists, and who would be the best people to win it. Many in Britain, George included, believed that the war against the colonists would be won swiftly, and one can perhaps forgive them for believing this. After their victories in the 7 Years' War against other major European powers, the small continental army that would be formulated seemed less of a threat than, say, a French or Prussian force. But unfortunately for George, underestimating one's enemy often has disastrous consequences, and this case would be no different. The Second Continental Congress met in 1775, and the American troops were renamed the Continental Army and would be under a promising 44-year-old general named George Washington. The Congress would, by the end of the year, declare its independence from the British Parliament. As far as the physical fighting went, the British Redcoats quickly found that the American troops would be no pushover, as the American militiamen used guerrilla-style warfare tactics of engaging and quickly disappearing into the countryside. The American troops were also incredibly accurate and proficient with their weapons, which had a devastating effect not only in losses, but in morale as well. Furthermore, the British government were at a logistical disadvantage, as not only did they have other realms to tend to, including Britain itself, but the cost of shipping and providing troops across the ocean was significant. The British won a victory at Bunker Hill, but incurred heavy losses, which proved to be a sobering experience for many of them. The colonies soon drafted something known as the Olive Branch Petition, which, as the name implies, attempted one last time to appeal to George's conciliatory mindset if there was one present. George rejected it, and by August 1775, the colonies were formally declared in open rebellion via the Proclamation of Rebellion in Parliament. The Prohibitory Act followed in October, banning all trade with the colonies. By July the following year, the colonies were ready to officially declare their separation from the Kingdom of Great Britain and George himself. By July 4, 1776, Thomas Jefferson had drafted a Declaration of Independence, officially declaring to the world their independence as a nation and the colonists' reasoning from separating from Britain. Again, legitimacy was needed for this separation, and thus George was personally attacked in the document, as much of the propaganda we discussed previously was used as a basis for declaring independence, although, as we have already touched on, much of these accusations were probably false. 5 days later, the inhabitants of New York pulled down an equestrian statue of George, which had been erected on Bowling Green in 1770. Interestingly, this statue would be melted down and used as musket balls in the war that followed. Regardless whether George was being fairly treated in the press or not, there was still a war at hand, and the British continued to believe that they would run roughshod over the Continental Army. Unfortunately for George, the prosecution of the war would, for lack of a better term, be botched by bad communication and too much autonomy for the British military leaders. A three-pronged approach was proposed, in which a force under a man named John Burgoyne would strike south from Canada, while General William Howe would capture New York and then meet up with Burgoyne in Albany to cut the colonies in half. A third force would head south to deal with the rebellion in the southern colonies. Despite the fact that the Continental Army was defeated multiple times, such was the case at the Battle of Long Island, the Continental Army were multiple times allowed to escape and fight another day. Nevertheless, the British were largely successful in many aspects of the war initially, especially when Sir William Howe took New York. However, the British eventually made serious mistakes that would leave the door open for the Americans and George Washington's Continental Army to have success, which would be aided by Washington himself, who made daring moves in order to gain great victories. In December 1776, Washington led his troops across the Delaware River at night and won a great victory at the Battle of Trenton, and then subsequently moved on to win the Battle of Princeton in January 1777. All three of the British forces were independent, separated, and isolated from each other, and again did not all come to one consensus as to the best strategy for winning the war on a large scale. General Howe, although understanding that Burgoyne wished to move south from Canada into Albany and wished Howe to reinforce him from the south when he did so, decided that he would rather capture the strategically unimportant capital city of Philadelphia instead. By July, Burgoyne reached Ticonderoga and reached word that Howe was not going to reinforce him due to his attempts to take Philadelphia. However, Burgoyne underestimated the continental strength of the rebel presence in New York State, and so continued to attempt to push south to Albany, despite knowing that Howe would not be rendezvousing with him. Howe would indeed capture Philadelphia after winning the battles of Brandywine and Germantown, which pushed George Washington back into winter quarters at Valley Forge, but this victory came at a serious cost. Burgoyne crossed the Hudson River near Saratoga, north of Albany, and after engaging American forces, was forced to entrench at Saratoga and request and await reinforcements that would, unfortunately for him and his army, never come. He was low on rations and eventually besieged by a large American force. Although some fighting did take place, Burgoyne was ultimately forced back to his position at Saratoga and found himself in a dire position, woefully isolated with little options. By October, Burgoyne was forced to surrender to the Americans, which was a devastating blow to the British war effort and, of course, George personally. Things were only to get worse. As we remember, the British had become isolated politically after the 7 Years' War, and their former opponents, specifically the French and the Spanish, were well aware of Britain's troubles in America. King Louis XVI of France, who had come to power in May 1774, just prior to the American Revolutionary War breaking out, was keen on humbling the British after being defeated in the 7 Years' War, despite the fact that France could not afford to be engaged in such a conflict at the time. Thus, France, and Spain for that matter, influenced in part by the Americans' victory at Saratoga, would eventually enter in the war on the side of the American colonies, thus opening new theaters of war and stretching British forces and supplies thin. With the war morphing into a war on a much larger scale and in different parts of the world, the British were not able to focus as much time and energy on the American theater, and this was obviously beneficial to the Americans' cause at large. In fact, it became more important, in a British sense, to defeat France and Spain ahead of defeating the rebels in America, especially since there was a threat to the British homeland from French and Spanish invasion, a very serious, and in fact planned, threat. Howe was replaced in Philadelphia by a man named Sir Henry Clinton, but many of Clinton's forces had to be evacuated in order to be redeployed elsewhere in the international conflict. Thus, he was forced to return to New York, with George Washington leaving his winter quarters at Valley Forge to pursue him and trap him there. Therefore, with the surrender at Saratoga and Clinton being trapped in New York, northern operations in America were largely abandoned by the British, and the focus of the war effort turned to the southern colonies. The British had already been successful in the South to a degree, having captured Savannah in 1778, and they continued to push the initiative, winning multiple victories in 1780 and 1781. A British Army general named Charles Cornwallis won victories for the British at the battles of Charleston, Camden, and Guilford Courthouse, which were all fought in North and South Carolina, and this, along with the defection of an American Major General, Benedict Arnold, over to the British, seemed to show that the American cause was slowly being worn down by British might. But the militiamen and American Continental forces would not break, and continued to fight on against what they perceived as tyranny. The British and their loyalist forces in America were defeated at the battles of Ramsar's Mill, Cowpens, and Kings Mountain, which strengthened the resolve of the Americans. Furthermore, one of the biggest and costliest blunders of the British war effort was about to take place and change the course of the war and history itself. General Cornwallis, who had suffered large casualties at Guilford Bridge, moved north through North Carolina and into Virginia, where he established camp on the Yorktown Peninsula. This isolated his force and made him reliant on the British Navy for assistance and protection. Unfortunately for him, the British Navy was stretched too thin in other theaters of war, and they could not be relied upon at that time to provide the protection and assistance that Cornwallis needed. Quickly, a French fleet, led by Admiral de Grasse, sailed for Yorktown and dispatched troops for a siege while blockading Cornwallis's British force by sea. The British quickly recognized the serious situation, and that the British Navy would have to defeat de Grasse in order to be able to relieve Cornwallis's forces at Yorktown if they wanted to have a chance of victory in America. The Battle of the Chesapeake ensued, with the Royal Naval Forces suffering defeat at the hands of the French. As more and more American Continental forces converged on Yorktown, which would include George Washington and his army, the siege of Yorktown commenced in September 1781. The situation for Cornwallis was hopeless, and in mid-October, he surrendered to the Franco-American forces. The war in America had just been lost. Although George wanted to continue the war in America, the writing was clearly on the wall after the defeat at Yorktown. Peace negotiations were afoot with the French and the Americans, but were dragging on due to Britain's desire to protect the Loyalists still in America. In September 1783, the Treaty of Paris was finally agreed to, officially recognizing the United States of America as a separate and independent nation and ending the American Revolutionary War. Britain would retain much of Canada, while the colonies were recognized as owning everything east of the Mississippi. It was a tough pill to swallow, but George nevertheless did it with dignity and professionalism. He welcomed ambassadors from the newly formed nation warmly in future encounters, although this was certainly not how he would be portrayed in America, as he continued to be villainized in the American press. By 1782, after years of requesting to be allowed to resign his position as Prime Minister, Lord North had finally been allowed to walk away from the post, again forcing George to formulate a new ministry. North was initially replaced by the Marquis of Rockingham once again, who had served in that role previously, But unfortunately, Rockingham died at the age of 52, only a couple months later from the flu, at which point he was replaced by the Earl of Shelburne, William Petty Fitzmaurice. By this point, an interesting and very important character had emerged within government and had begun to make headway in British politics, being made the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the new ministry. He was a young 23-year-old man who had ties to one of the most famous men in prior years. His name was William Pitt, son of the aforementioned William Pitt, Earl of Chatham, the hero of the 7 Years' War, who had died giving a speech in Parliament. Pitt would eventually become known as William Pitt the Younger to distinguish himself from his famous father, and he would end up playing a major role in George's political life in the future, as we will see. Unfortunately for George, Lord North, after resigning the premiership, joined forces with a man named Charles James Fox in Parliament, essentially teaming up to form opposition to the new Shelburne ministry, who himself resigned in March 1783. George greatly disliked, or perhaps even disdained, Fox, as Fox had been one of his arch rivals in Parliament over the years. Fox had accused George of exhibiting tyrannical tendencies, had supported the Americans in their War of Independence, and had taken any chance possible to oppose the king and his government. With Lord North and Fox now allied against him in Parliament, George was forced to bring forward William Henry Cavendish Bentinck, Duke of Portland, as Prime Minister, making the number of times that a ministry change had taken place 9. George had little confidence in, and in fact detested, the Duke of Portland's ministry, essentially a pseudo-Fox North-influenced ministry, and was finding it difficult to find a prime minister that could effectively put forth a government that would fall in line with what he wanted for the nation at large. With the Duke of Portland as prime minister in alliance with North and Fox, George was looking for any way to release himself from the bonds of this opposition ministry and was refusing to extend patronage to it. He was able to luckily find an out in the form of the young William Pitt the Younger, discussed previously, who after negotiating hard with the king was offered and accepted the premiership once George had gladly dismissed Portland from the post. This was at the time a risky move, as Pitt was young for the role, being only 24 years old and inexperienced to a degree. In fact, he was the youngest prime minister to ever hold that position and retains that title to this day, but luckily for George, the political apple did not fall far from the tree, and Pitt, even in his youth, proved to be a wise politician as his father had been. Pitt and George were not friends per se, but meshed well politically, and this would be something that would become very important as the incredible events of George's reign unfolded. However, by 1788, a new devastatingly unfortunate chapter of George's life would be revealed and cause great concern to the nation. In June and July 1788, when George was 50 years old, he fell ill with intense stomach, back, and side pain. He also noticed pain in his face and was finding it difficult to sleep. More concerning, however, was the change in George's attitude and behavior. It had been over 23 years since George had experienced what many believed was his first short bout of manic depression. Although this had only lasted a short time and had been successfully kept under wraps from the public by the Queen, this time George's illness would not be able to be hidden from the public eye. George began to act in a wide variety of ways that were unbecoming and uncharacteristic of his personality and moral values in the years past. He often became confused, reserved, or violently angry, and began to incessantly talk non-stop about an array of bizarre topics to people. He would speak so much, 19 hours straight at one point, that his voice would grow hoarse from overuse, and he would often foam at the mouth. He would speak with his 2 young sons, Alfred and Octavius, who had by that time been dead for many years, and became infatuated with the woman who was not the Queen. However, these bizarre and uncharacteristic actions by George would oftentimes be followed by bouts of complete lucidity, where he would seemingly completely have his wits about him, being able to act and converse in a normal, logical manner. This oftentimes meant that George became well aware of his odd behavior, but was powerless to stop it, a sad fact to absorb in the modern day. Unfortunately, 18th century medicine had only come so far, and unsurprisingly, not much was known in the mental health realm, although there certainly was a basic understanding in some regards. George was initially subjected to painful remedies, like cupping, bleeding, leeching, and blistering, in an attempt to pull the evil spirits from his body, which of course only made George feel worse. Discussions were had about possibly instituting a regency with the Prince of Wales or the Queen at the head. Queen Charlotte was understandably greatly disturbed by George's mental problems and was forced to stop sleeping in the same bed as him, as he was only getting around 2 hours of sleep at night and would often sweat intensely. Prince George took control of the situation and isolated George, and Pitt and the Queen finally called for special doctors who had experience with mental health to be installed for George's use, specifically a man named Dr. Francis Willis. George seemed to recover for some time, but relapsed when he was moved from Windsor to Kew Lodge, where he often would try and escape and became increasingly violent, to the point that he had to be straitjacketed and placed in a restraining chair. Some in government, including Pitt, wanted Parliament to control the government during a regency, while others, such as Charles James Fox, believed that the young Prince of Wales should be allowed to take full powers of the monarch. A regency bill was introduced by Pitt, which would have saw the Prince of Wales installed as regent, but before this could be passed, George recovered enough to return to his normal business. Although there were still some moments of confusion and excessive speaking as he was recovering, George was clearly on the mend, and within time, he had fully recovered to his old self. The king and queen returned to the same bed, and George was finally able to return to normal business. What would have happened if a regency had been enacted with the Prince of Wales as regent is hard to say, but it most likely would have been a disaster, especially given the events we are about to discuss. Back in August 1780, the Prince of Wales had turned 18 and had been becoming an increasing problem for his father. He was becoming an unruly and overindulgent young man, which manifested in unbelievable spending habits and escapades with women. He had been refused his own household or income, and by 1784 was in astoundingly deep financial debt due to his extravagant spending and lack of financial understanding. George, over his life, would be forced to secure funding to pay his heirs' debts, which the prince simply racked up again. Furthermore, the prince had secretly married a woman named Mrs. Fitzherbert, which was at the time against the law, as George had, after being embarrassed by the marriages of some of his brothers, passed the Royal Marriages Bill in February 1772, which prevented any descendant of George II from marrying without the consent of the monarch. Obviously, with Prince George marrying secretly, he broke this law and continued to be a thorn in his father's side whenever he could. The prince often actively opposed his father publicly and developed friendships with George's enemies like Charles James Fox. This relationship between father and son unfortunately continued the tradition of Hanoverian kings being at odds with their eldest sons and heirs. Nevertheless, the king had thankfully recovered from his debilitating mental illness in time to prevent the prince from taking control, which was seriously important and lucky because some of the most incredible events in world history were about to unfold. The Kingdom of France had for many years been going through an economic depression, brought on by an array of issues, but in part by France's government spending, which of course had included the spending related to the American Revolutionary War. The lower classes of the French populace were under great financial strain as the economic gap between them and the aristocracy continued to widen. In 1789, Louis XVI called the Estates General of France, which represented France's three estates: the clergy, i.e. the first estate, the nobility, i.e. the second estate, and the commoners, i.e. the third estate. The third estate, being fed up with the state of affairs, took radical steps to create the so-called National Assembly in order to legislate alone, and invited the other two estates to join. Louis XVI attempted to end this change by dispersing the group from their meeting place, but the new assembly would not waver and famously met at a tennis court outside Versailles to continue their work. On July 14, 1789, the Bastille, a medieval armory, fortress, and political prison, was stormed, with prisoners being freed and the governor being killed. The Bastille was a symbol of power and royal authority, and its storming represented, in many a mind, the victory of the lower classes over the absolutist, monarchical, and feudal hierarchical structure that existed in France. These events were the first steps in what would infamously become known as the French Revolution. Despite attempts to quell the storm, Louis XVI was not able to prevent the revolutionary spirit from spreading. By 1792, the feudal system in France had been abolished, and Louis XVI had been captured and imprisoned. There were international powers, which included Prussia and Austria, who wished to support Louis XVI and were keen on taking steps to free him and his Austrian wife, Marie Antoinette. They agreed to the Declaration of Pillnitz, which acknowledged their joint support for the French monarchy and desire to help them militarily. In April and July 1792, revolutionary France declared war on Austria and Prussia, with both these countries invading France soon after. Thus began what is known today as the French Revolutionary Wars, which included the so-called War of the First Coalition and the so-called War of the Second Coalition, both of which we will discuss shortly. Britain for the time being remained neutral, despite George and many in Britain's disdain for what was happening in France. However, there was concern that the revolutionary spirit seen in France might spill across the channel and give courage to some in Britain who may hold similar views about the monarchy. Furthermore, the French won a great victory at the Battle of Valmy in the War of the First Coalition, which gave the governing body at the time in France, the so-called National Convention, confidence to abolish the French monarchy as a whole in 1792, which created the First French Republic. Valmy was followed by a victory in the Austrian Netherlands, modern-day Belgium, at Jemappes, which allowed the French to control the Channel ports. By that time, a radical group of the French government, which would eventually become known as the Committee of Public Safety, had taken effective control and were led by a radical faction known as the Jacobins, whose most famous member was Maximilien Robespierre. They did the unthinkable. On January 21, 1793, they executed the reigning French monarch, Louis XVI, by guillotine in Paris. Throughout the world, people were shocked and appalled at this action, not least George, who was greatly troubled by this event. By February, the French declared war on Britain, and after the coalition victory at the Battle of Neerwinden in March 1793, which resulted in a French general's desertion to the coalition after the fighting, the Committee of Public Safety was officially formed by the ruling French National Convention. This group, again dominated by the radical Jacobin faction, continually gained power until by December 1793 they gained full executive power. Thus began what is infamously remembered today as the Reign of Terror in France, where thousands of people were executed or died in prison as a result of the committee's radical revolutionary ideals, although exactly when the Reign of Terror began is still debated today. France continued to prosecute the war effectively, despite the fact that the Radical Committee of Public Safety had to be overthrown via the Thermidorian reaction in 1794, which eventually saw the Jacobins ousted and certain members like Robespierre guillotined. They were replaced by a group referred to as the French Directory. France continued to gain ground, and by 1796 and 1797, there was a great desire for peace in Britain. George, however, was against peace negotiations and wished to attempt to wear down the French economically over time. Unfortunately for George, however, the French's successes were furthered when a young 26-year-old general named Napoleon Bonaparte took control of the French forces in Italy, unified northern Italy under French control, and knocked Austria out of the war via the Peace of Leoben. The Austrian Netherlands would, for the time being, remain in French hands. By October 1797, the War of the First Coalition had ended, leaving Britain isolated against the might of the French after all of her allies, including Prussia, made peace with France. George and the British did not make peace with the French and set about attempting to create another coalition to fight against France and her client states that had been formed as a consequence of France's victories. Unfortunately, events in Ireland caused the focus to shift, at least for a time, to George's western realm. In 1798, an Irish rebellion broke out, brought on by the influence of the American and French revolutions and the religious tension that had existed there for centuries. The rebellion was quickly crushed following the victory at the Battle of Vinegar Hill, but this uprising was concerning to George, and he became convinced that a political union needed to be made with Ireland to prevent further issues seeping into British politics. England, Scotland, and Ireland had all been ruled in a personal union since the reign of James I of England and VI of Scotland, which began in 1603, but all these nations had had separate parliaments during that time. In 1707, Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, had united England and Scotland politically via the Acts of Union, thus politically merging the parliaments of the two realms into one kingdom of Great Britain. Ireland, however, had continued to retain a separate parliament even after this union. Although it would not officially come into effect until 1801, George oversaw the implementation of the Acts of Union of 1800 in Parliament, which would see Ireland politically united with Great Britain, officially creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. With Ireland pacified for the time being, attention turned to General Napoleon Bonaparte's travels to Egypt. As it turned out, Napoleon was being sent to Egypt as a first step towards campaigning against British India, but a British fleet led by Admiral Horatio Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, which cemented Britain's naval supremacy for the remainder of the war. This battle was all part of the beginning stages of what would become known as the War of the Second Coalition. This victory, along with victory at the Siege of Acre, in part influenced other European powers to join this Second Coalition against the French, and would ultimately see Napoleon return to France. Upon his return to France, however, Napoleon seized power there via the coup of 18 Brumaire, in which he was declared as the first consul of France, replacing the Directory with the French Consulate of 3. Napoleon attempted to negotiate peace with Britain, but George and the British did not want to give the French any time to recover or organize, nor did they want to abandon their allies in the Second Coalition. But Napoleon was Napoleon, and he was not to be deterred. Unfortunately, it was around this time that George had another relapse into a manic depressive episode. Many believe that this was brought on by the resignation of William Pitt the Younger as Prime Minister due to he and George's disagreement over Catholic emancipation in Ireland, which George was vehemently opposed to. Although George was quite tolerant of Catholicism, oftentimes interacting with Catholic peers throughout his life, he was seriously dedicated to living up to his coronation oath of protecting the Protestant Anglican faith in Britain, and did not believe that emancipating the Catholics would do any good, as he believed that it could only bring forth problems. He believed that one state religion should be adhered to, which of course needed to be Anglicanism in his mind. Furthermore, he was afraid that lessening limitations on Catholics would also bring forth a resurgence in nationalism, which he obviously did not want to see, especially after the Acts of Union between Ireland and Britain had come into effect in 1801. Once again, George developed the symptoms that had plagued him previously, violent anger, incessant talking, etc., and this was very concerning as there was still a major international war at hand. He was removed from his family and essentially held against his will while being placed into forced isolation. His mental doctors once again began implementing the harsh treatment that he had endured previously, despite the fact that George seemed to be recovering, although not completely. He was eventually released after going on a quasi-strike, but by that time the events in the war were moving quickly and would soon be coming to an end. Although the British had continued to secure a few victories in the War of the Second Coalition, French victories at Hohenlinden and Marengo meant that Napoleon had consolidated his power as first consul and was in a good position militarily. This ultimately led to the Treaty of Amiens in 1802, which ended the War of the Second Coalition between Britain and France. Under the terms of the treaty, Britain was forced to recognize the First French Republic for what it was, the replacement for the monarchy in France. The Treaty of Amiens ultimately ended the so-called French Revolutionary Wars as well, but this was far from the end of hostilities. Napoleon began reorganizing France, and in 1803 was making moves to extend French influence on the continent. The rearmament of Britain and France once again ensued, and was followed by an outbreak of hostilities shortly thereafter. This time, hostilities would hit much closer to home, as Napoleon set out to attempt to invade Britain itself. In 1804, George once again mentally relapsed into a manic depressive state, this time falling in and out of bouts of mania, which had an unfortunate effect. Despite the loving relationship that he and his wife, Queen Charlotte, had had in the years past, this bout of madness was the straw that broke the camel's back. The pair essentially separated, although not officially. They saw each other less and less, and stopped sleeping in the same bed. One cannot but sympathize with the Queen, as George, when in this manic state, would have been very difficult to be around. Nevertheless, it was a sad ending to a long and mostly successful loving marriage. William Pitt the Younger once again became Prime Minister after actively opposing the man who had replaced him, Henry Addington. In May 1804, Addington resigned, and Pitt was restored to the premiership, which was good in that Pitt was considered the most able person to defend the kingdom against a Napoleonic invasion while the king was mentally unstable. 1804 was also the year that Napoleon had himself crowned as Emperor of France as Napoleon I, thus eliminating the French consulate and replacing the First French Republic with the First French Empire. Pitt was able to formulate yet another coalition in 1805 with Austria and Russia, among other European powers, and the conflict that would arise from this coalition would become known as the War of the Third Coalition, part of a larger group of conflicts known today as the Napoleonic Wars. Although the British Navy, led by Admiral Horatio Nelson, won a great victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, which ultimately secured Britain from a French invasion threat, the Third Coalition did not fare well in the war, especially after Napoleon's great victory at Austerlitz in December 1805. This ultimately destroyed the Third Coalition and led to the Treaty of Pressburg, which ended the War of the Third Coalition. Further concern was added to the picture when William Pitt the Younger, only 46 years old, died in January 1806. This, of course, was a serious loss, and he was replaced by William Grenville, Lord Grenville. Grenville's ministry attempted to install Catholic emancipation once again, but this was defeated and he was eventually dismissed and replaced by the Duke of Portland, who we remember had already been Prime Minister once before in 1807. A fourth coalition was created in 1806, with Prussia now entering the fray, but the Prussians were defeated by Napoleon at the Battle of Jena Auerstedt in October 1806, and the Russians at Friedland in June 1807, bringing a quick conclusion to what had been the War of the Fourth Coalition. After this, two adjacent conflicts erupted, which included the Peninsular War in Spain in 1807, where a man named Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, would make a large impact, and the War of the Fifth Coalition in 1809, which would see Austria again defeated by Napoleon. The Peninsular War would continue through to 1814, and George was forced to make one final change to the premiership in 1809 after the Duke of Portland, the sitting prime minister, was forced to resign due to health issues. George installed a man named Spencer Perceval into the prime minister role in October 1809, the last prime minister he would appoint. The Napoleonic Wars were far from over, and George would still be alive when Napoleon was ultimately defeated. Unfortunately, by that time, things would have changed dramatically, for in 1810, George entered into his last and most debilitating manic depressive episode, one that he would never recover from. In May 1810, George received news of an assassination attempt on his son Ernest Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, who had been attacked while in bed. Although his son would survive, this news was very concerning to George and shocked him greatly. Furthermore, the same day he received news that his youngest and favorite daughter, Amelia, was ill and that there was little chance that she would survive. This bad news, related to his children, seemed to have set in motion a bout of George's manic depression that would unfortunately consume him for the rest of his life, despite the fact that in total, his previous mental illness bouts had only collectively lasted about 12 months. As had been the case with his previous bouts of mental illness, George started showing symptoms of physical illness similar to that of a cold first, which were followed by the mental relapses. The doctors this time around were unprepared and did not reference George's previous treatment that had worked for him in years past, and so George was not in the best of hands for his final illness initially. Princess Amelia would indeed die from her sickness in November 1810, but by then, George's mind was too far gone to comprehend this news. The fact that he had cared for his children so much in his youth and showed such a degree of devotion to them, only to matter-of-factly receive the news of his favorite daughter's death, was an indicator to many that he would never recover. He continued to go downhill mentally, having to be straitjacketed and restrained in his chair often. The Regency Bill that Pitt had prepared in years past was resurrected, which would give Prince George limited control unless 12 months lapsed with no improvement in George's mental state, at which point the prince would take over full control of government. This is, of course, exactly what happened, and Prince George eventually took over control of his father's duties as regent. The king, over time, was kept in his private quarters, and again began having delusions, often carrying on conversations with Lord North, who had died over 18 years prior in 1792. By 1812, dementia set in, and George gradually began to fade away from all those around him and recognized less and less people. June of that year saw his last interview with the Queen, who would die 6 years later, something that George never comprehended. His final years were spent in extreme lonely isolation, as his family and friends visited him less and less, although his need for extreme measures like straitjackets at least lessened. He grew a long beard, and to pass the time, played his harpsichord, folded handkerchiefs, and buttoned and unbuttoned waistcoats. Major events were taking place throughout the world and in his private life, including the assassination of his last prime minister, Perceval, Napoleon's eventual defeat and abdication, his being declared King of Hanover, the death of his wife, the Queen, the death of Prince George's daughter, the death of some of his children, and the birth of his granddaughter, Victoria, who would eventually become Queen herself, all of which he was completely detached from and unaware of. He had been going blind in at least one eye for years, and in 1817 he was completely blind, deaf, and had to be pushed in a wheelchair. On the evening of January 29, 1820, almost 10 years since his last relapse into manic depression had commenced, King George III of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, King of Hanover, died of pneumonia at Windsor Castle. He was 81 years old. George's funeral was held at St. George's Chapel at Windsor rather than at Westminster Abbey, where many of the previous British monarchs had typically chose to be buried. He was the first to start this tradition, which continues to this day. He was laid to rest in the royal vault underneath St. George's Chapel, a vault that he had commissioned during his life. St. George's Chapel can still be visited to this day. The life and reign of George III is one of perhaps the most interesting, eventful, and disturbing reigns in the history of the British monarchy. Growing up in a factional Hanoverian royal family, his relationship with his father was cut short at a young age. Despite this, George and his father's relationship seemingly strayed from the unfortunate tradition that the Hanoverian kings had followed, and that he and his father had a reasonably good relationship, and his father was able to instill in him certain ideals that would last the remainder of his life. George was raised to be a patriot king, immune from the influences of faction and political strife. Although over his time as king, avoiding political conflict due to the factional nature of British politics was surely difficult, George can certainly be seen as being successful in toppling the oligarchic stranglehold that the old Whig politicians had on government at the time, as Tories and Whig opposition MPs were able to regain a degree of influence over time. The stress that he surely endured as part of this process, with a seemingly revolving door of sometimes ineffective prime ministers, cannot be understated. Yet George maintained his government properly throughout the course of his reign, and was able to, at least at times, see the right men put into the right positions at the right time to deal with certain problems. George did his best to be a good man, as his detestation of vice and honoring of God and religion showed. He attempted to live up to the standards that his mother, father, and mentor set for him in early life, and did his best to extend these standards onto the populace and his children as well. This, of course, was not necessarily successful or even a good thing per se, as his attempts to prevent what he perceived as vice from influencing his family led to anxious and embarrassing lives for both his siblings and his children. Many incredible events took place during his reign, both good and bad for George. He is perhaps the most propagandized king in the history of the English or British monarchy due to the loss of the American colonies and the unfortunate mental illness he was forced to endure during his life. Even to this day, over 200 years after his death, George is often reflected upon in America as a would-be tyrant that was halted in his tyrannical tracks by the glorious victory of the American founding fathers in the American Revolutionary War. In reality, the truth is much more nuanced than this. George was certainly no tyrant, but in that time, a fledgling nation needed a villain in order to validate their cause publicly, and it comes as no surprise that George was chosen to fill this role. Nevertheless, in today's world, we as a society understand now that history is written by the victors, and in George's case, he was certainly not victorious in America. Perhaps the most difficult facts to hear when learning about George's time as king are related to his mental illness and the pain and the distress he must have felt being fully cognizant of his illness at times, yet being unable to stop it. As if the stress that goes along with being a monarch of a nation wasn't enough, his manic depression only added fuel to an already incredibly stressful fire that was his life. Although it is popular to refer to George as a mad king, which he certainly was at times, this can certainly give the wrong impression as to what his madness entailed. No one suffered more from George's madness than George himself, and in a time of constitutional monarchy, George was certainly not in a position to hurt others, either physically or through policy, nor did he, as he was removed from his major duties and assisted to the best of the ability of those around him until he recovered. Nevertheless, despite the downfalls that George experienced, he also experienced great triumphs. George, at the time of his death, was the longest reigning monarch of Britain, having served as king for over 59 years. This feat has only been broken by 2 monarchs since, and George remains, to this day, one of the longest reigning monarchs in British history. Ireland officially became part of Britain politically, making George the first king of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. One of the greatest military leaders in history, Napoleon, was ultimately defeated during George's time as king, albeit not completely until George's mind had gone, but nevertheless, George was one of the key figures in the international politics up to his final illness, which stood up to the military prowess of one of the world's most famous warriors. One cannot help but wonder how the world would be different today if George had not gone mad at the end of his life, if the American colonies had not been lost, and if the United States remained as part of the British Empire to this day. Could this have even been a possibility, or was the break with America inevitable? One can never know. But no matter how one remembers George, as a mad, tyrannical oppressor, or as an unfairly remembered and unfortunately afflicted monarch, it cannot be denied that his reign was certainly one of the most unbelievably incredible reigns in the history of the British Isles.